The topic of this video is Samuel Richardson, born 1689, died 1761. So he was born in Derbyshire in the East Midlands, sort of the middle north part of the island, Great Britain. He was the son of a cabinet maker and was brought up in poverty. His father sent the sons off to various trade schools, and by 1706, Richardson was apprenticed to a London printer named John Wilde. Apprenticed with him for a number of years, learned the business of publishing, basically, during that time. In 1721, he established his own print shop and married the daughter of his former master, Martha Wilde. Certainly feeling like he could do that with his own print shop, and they lived there in the print shop. From 1723 to 28, he's involved in printing and writing seditious Jacobite pamphlets in opposition to the Hanoverian government, but manages to elude prosecution. And during this time, he makes an important political connection as well. Politician named Arthur Onslow. He was a member of the House of Commons. He would actually become Speaker of the House and would hold that position for decades, all the way up until the year of Richardson's death, in fact. But this connection with Arthur Onslow would become very important to Richardson's career. This is a drawing of Richardson reading, I believe, Sir Charles Grandison at his home called the Grange. In 1731, his wife Martha died, and they had 6 children. 4 of them were sons, but none of these children survived beyond the age of 4. Some of them did live beyond Martha's death, but none of them lived past the age of 4, tragically. In 1733, he marries another woman named Elizabeth Leake, whose father was also in the print and publishing business, and he would have 6 more children with her. 2 of them sons, but only 4 of these children, all of them daughters, would live to adulthood. And with Onslow's support during this period, he becomes the official printer of bills and committee reports for the House of Commons. This is a pretty big deal. Obviously, he's printing material for the government, and this no doubt gives him a great deal of security and allows him to publish, gives him some success and some recognition, and brings in more business, of course. So he's very successful by this point. In 1733, he published a conduct manual for apprentices. All through the 1720s and early 1730s, Richardson took on apprentices in his print shop, sort of showing young men the business, how to load the forms with type, how to run the press, and so forth. And he published this conduct manual because he was concerned about the morality of apprentices, worried that they were spending too much time in the theaters watching plays, for example. 1739, some of Richardson's friends asked him to write a conduct manual in the form of a series of letters suitable for young girls about to enter service. And all the kind of moral dangers they would be exposed to. Think about Moll Flanders, for example. These letters were later published as letters written to and for particular friends. But while he was working on this, he began to think, well, maybe a novel would be better. He wasn't thinking about a novel, of course, but he began to think about assembling some letters in a fictional world, and these coalesced into the novel, his first novel. By this point, he's 50, in his early 50s, and this first novel was called Pamela. Pamela was immensely successful, and it went through 4 editions within its first year, setting off a flurry of satirical imitations. We'll read one of these by Henry Fielding, Joseph Andrews. spurious continuations or sequels of the novel, and even Richardson himself wrote a sequel that was not very well received called Pamela in Her Exalted Condition. This will make more sense when you actually read the novel and get to the end. 1747 to 48, he published his greatest work, Clarissa, in 3 installments. It is enormous. If I had more time to teach the course, we would read Clarissa instead of Pamela, but it is huge. It is an immense work. Probably, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5, 6 times the size of Pamela. During the late 1740s, he provides assistance and advice to women novelists, Sarah Fielding, the sister of Henry Fielding, and another woman named Jane Collier. And he is so impressed with Collier that he actually hires her as a governess to his daughters and winds up printing some of her books a little bit later. In 1753-54, he publishes the last of his great epistolary novels, Sir Charles Grandison. His fans said, "Well, you've been, all of your protagonists have been women. Why don't you have one who's a man?" And he said, "Okay, I can do that." And he wrote Sir Charles Grandison. During this time, his health begins to decline, but he becomes the master of the Stationers' Company, which was a London organization that regulated the British publishing industry. 1755, now in very poor health and at the urging of literary friends, publishes a collection of the moral and instructive sentiments, maxims, cautions, and reflections contained in the histories of Pamela, Clarissa, and Sir Charles Grandison. And I mention this because the title of that tells you that these novels were seen not just as popular entertainment, but as providing serious moral instruction. And Richardson was always very concerned about the moral utility of his novels. In 1761, he suffered a stroke and passed away. So let's talk a little bit about Pamela. The subtitle is Virtue Rewarded. And like I said, it came out in 1740. And it is an example of what we call the epistolary fiction, a series of letters from a beautiful young damsel. We're looking at the title page of one of the early editions of the book. A couple of things that stand out here is on the title page is the clear moral message in order to cultivate the principles of virtue and religion in the minds of the youth of both sexes. And the second interesting passage on here, which is not in later editions, is this explanation for the project, a narrative which has its foundation in truth and nature. So this is fiction, but Richardson wants us to see that this, even though it's a fiction, it is founded in things that are true. And at the same time that it agreeably entertains by a variety of curious and affecting incidents, is entirely divested of all those images which in too many pieces calculated for amusement only tend to inflame the minds they should instruct. So I think he has in mind in particular the London theaters of the time, which were seen as dens of vice and unbridled passions. So I'm going to show you a later edition. And by later, I'm talking like, a year or so later. So here's the title page of one of the later editions. I'm not sure which one. It says here the sixth edition. We see that the message there about the principles of virtue in the minds of the youth of both sexes is still there. But here on the title page, we see this edition. And afterwards, in her exalted condition between her and persons of figure and quality upon the most important and entertaining subjects in genteel life. So letters is what this is referring to, letters between her and persons of figure and quality. So this particular edition incorporated Richardson's sequel, which we're not going to read in this class. It is not part of our edition. but it is not particularly well regarded. And it wasn't at the time either. So I used the term epistolary to describe the novel earlier, and Pamela is one of the earliest novels presented almost entirely as a collection of written correspondence, letters, diary entries, and so forth. And some critics credit Richardson with the maturation of the novelistic form, if not for the invention of it. This is disputable, of course, and we've already looked at Defoe, who was writing his fictions decades before Richardson. But since ancient times, writers had employed the form of the private letter, the epistle, to impersonate a character or advance plot. The heroides of the Latin poet Ovid, for example. And there had been, of course, published correspondence like the love letters exchanged between Abelard and Héloïse that inspired Alexander Pope's poem. And long before either Richardson or Pope, a man named James Howell published his familiar letters in the middle of the 17th century, but these were presented in the form of a memoir with himself as the sole correspondent. There was a series of fictional love letters between a nobleman and his sister. Sometimes this has been attributed to the writer Aphra published between 1684 and 87, so long before Defoe or any of these, Pope or Richardson. But even though it's fiction, it does not rely exclusively on letters the way Richardson's novel does, and the aristocratic characters, Sylvia and Philander, in that work. They really belong more to the genre of romance. Pamela is different. It delivers its plot almost entirely without the intervention of an omniscient narrator. I say almost. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And the characters of Pamela come from the world of Richardson's readers. They are not shepherds and shepherdesses. So some of the important features of the epistolary novel, some of the advantages that it brings to the writer and to the reader, has to do with realism. And again, when we use the word novel in the 18th century, we're talking about realist fiction. And the letters of these novels, of epistolary novels, give the appearance of authenticity. We seem to have direct access to characters' inner thoughts and feelings. Characters' actions, thoughts, and utterances seem more immediate and unpremeditated than what we observe in a fictional memoir like Moll Flanders. We get real-time accounting, so characters describe events as they're happening and while in the very process of writing a letter. And finally, letters provide multiple perspectives and opportunities for irony. We don't get this so much in Pamela. We certainly get it in Richardson's later novels, Clarissa and Charles Grandison. But the different letters, the multiple perspectives, we get different perceptions and interpretations of and responses to exactly the same situation. So all of the participants write letters describing the same events and come away with different impressions and conclusions. As Richardson's first experiment in epistolary fiction, then, Pamela is not exactly perfect. So, for example, he's limited readers to Pamela's perspective, so we rely almost entirely on her own descriptions and interpretations of events. With the exception of the occasional letter from her parents, or when a letter not addressed to her falls mistakenly into her hands, we are pretty much confined to what she sees, what she hears, what she feels, and most importantly, what she remembers. This perhaps explains why Richardson's voice abruptly intrudes upon the narrative starting on page 92. That's certainly a page for you to flag and read carefully. It's something that Richardson won't do again until the very end of the novel. And he does this not just to inform the reader of Mr. B's devious plans, of which Pamela herself is not even yet aware, but also to explain her misapprehensions about the delivery of her letters to her parents. John Arnold is in fact sharing those letters with Mr. B, and several of them we now learn were never in fact delivered. Richardson also uses this opportunity as an awkward pretext for inserting a letter from Mr. B to Pamela's father, as though it were necessary for the editor to explain the appearance of a letter that had not passed directly through her hands. And finally, and most disruptively, Richardson seizes this opportunity to pronounce directly upon the moral of the story, an impulse that he resists for the rest of the novel, that is, up until the very end. So this is a unique moment in the novel that we'll certainly want to take a look at. So some questions, things for you to think about as you're reading. Look for evidence of the effects of the epistolary form. Where do you see its advantages or disadvantages? How does Richardson use clothes and other class markers to distinguish his characters? And to what extent is the novel a commentary on the English class system, particularly with regard to marriage? And as a novel with an explicit moral purpose, as we see stated right on the title page, what does Richardson promote as virtuous behavior for men and women? And what kind of behavior is not rewarded in the novel? And we'll base our discussion in class primarily on these kinds of questions. And that concludes this presentation introducing Samuel Richardson's novel, Pamela.